Hello there, I'm Blackbright, broadcasting out of the UK. I woke up 3 o'clock this morning. Today is my mother's funeral, and I was just called to reflect on who I am now my mother is no longer here. We're putting her to rest today, and I felt inspired to write a little bit about who I am, to share who I am with you, because my mother is a part of who I am, and the experiences that we have endured and enjoyed together are the making of who I am and why I am who I am today. So I'm just going to read it quickly because the funeral is at midday. So she wanted light colours, she wanted pastel colours. So we're not in the traditional dark colours. So I put in here, sticks and stones will break my bones, and words will always haunt me. In order to know who I am, you will need to know something about my mother. It is ironic that Windrush is synonymous with scandal, because my birth was also synonymous with scandal at the time. Raised in a reputable home and a respectable member of the church, my mother found herself beguiled by my father and discovered she was pregnant shortly thereafter. My father was a renowned police officer in the parish, tall, good-looking, eloquent, and extremely handsome. It was simple. They loved each other, and she would ask him to marry her, and of course he would. However, when she shared her situation with her close friend, she was informed that he might already be married, and her inquiries and his reluctant admission proved that he was. Feeling embarrassed, she decided that she could not disappoint her parents and took advantage of the invitation to come to work in England. My grandparents were pretty well off, and my mother was a skilled seamstress, so she asked her father for money for the trip to England and related expenses, and also money to tide her over. Her father gave her the money without questions, as he trusted her. I would imagine that the invitation to come to the UK was not open to pregnant women, so my mother had to conceal her pregnancy. There was an assumption that Commonwealth citizens who accepted the invitation would not have any money or talent, so could easily be exploited and ridiculed. This would be in keeping with the image most white Brits had at the time of blacks, that they were unintelligent derivatives of the ape family. However, that was far from the truth. Those who came from the islands had to pay their way, and they could only do so if they were financially comfortable. They would have been skilled in order to be employed, and many were overqualified, but because of the jobs they came to fill were mostly menial, many became de-skilled. The UK minister of that time set the scene for a group of British Commonwealth citizens to feel unwanted and disappointed. A message sent to the governor of Jamaica in May 1948, a few months ahead of the arrival of the Windrush ship, was designed to prevent no more than the initial 492 passengers from arriving in the UK. 492 was already 492 too many. According to David Olusoga's research, the message to the British governor of Jamaica was apologetic, but in fact a warning that the UK would regrettably not be in a position to offer them all employment because most of them had no particular skill and a few would only have a few pounds on their arrival. The UK government's assessment of the skill set of those on board was based on assumptions and stereotypes, but the door was already ajar and Commonwealth citizens took advantage of the opportunity. 4 years later, in 1952, my mother became a part of that legacy, and so did I. Ambitious Caribbeans were undeterred by challenge and saw rejection as an opportunity for acceptance. They were not wrapped up in cotton wool like the millennials today. Their illusions of grandeur and great expectations were quickly dismantled when they arrived, so my mother and others like her were forced to be creative, resourceful, and resilient. determined not to let the side down. My mother always said nothing good ever came easy, and her faith in God was enough to get her through. My mother was afraid for me from the day I was born. She knew she was raising a child who had unfair advantage, not only because of her precarious situation, but because of her colour in a white man's land, and because her father was not with her, and because she didn't want to be looked down on by others, so she felt extremely vulnerable. I would have to be concealed until it was necessary that I be revealed. The stigma attached to illegitimacy back then was real, so both her and I were beginning life in the UK on a playing field that was more uneven for us than for anyone else. I often imagine how different I would be if I had been born in the land of my conception. Jamaicans are so liberal, outspoken, and authentic. I was born in a house in South Kensington. My birth was assisted by my mother's roommate, who happened to be a nurse. My mother told me that she saw a newspaper on the floor promoting the film Bells on Their Toes, starring Myrna Loy, and decided to name me after her because she believed that the name would give me the celebrity status one day, just like the original Myrna Loy. But I was born and raised with guilt. The guilt my mother felt for deciding to keep me, the guilt my mother felt for not being able to provide for me in the way she had wanted to, and the guilt my mother felt for being unable to care for me without the intervention of foster parents. When my mother felt confident that she could provide for me and brought me home, it was too late. I resented her for taking me from the home and the people I had got used to, which played out in my behaviour, and forced her to remind me on many occasions everything she had done for me. I was reminded that my mother was forced to make choices she would not otherwise have made. I was a constant reminder of my mother's misjudgment. I reminded her of the weakness she felt under the charms of my father. I reminded her of the sacrifice she made, leaving her parents to come to England, not knowing that she was pregnant. I reminded her of her inability to provide for me unless she put me in a foster home. I reminded her of her failure and regret. Instead of me feeling guilty, I felt deprived and resentful. And because of my attitude, my mother found it difficult to love me in the way she wanted to. My mother preferred children to adults, who she claimed would never disappoint her. She would always say, "Why do children have to grow up?" By the time my mother came for me a few years later and showed me our new home, which was an achievement for her, I had been deprived of stability, love, and affection. I became rebellious. I felt my mother didn't have a right to tell me what to do because she had given me away. Whatever she told me, I tried to prove her wrong. In anger, my mother told me that no man would ever marry me. I proved her wrong. In frustration, she would tell me that Jamaicans look for their women in two places, the kitchen and the bedroom. So I married a Jamaican to prove her wrong. But she was right, because I married the wrong Jamaican. When disappointed, she would say I would never amount to anything. So I was constantly trying to prove that I could amount to something, but something would usually go wrong. Her message of failure must have run deep because unknowingly I found myself giving up when I faced hurdles in life and in relationships, which ultimately led me to feel as though I had failed. My mother needed me to be a success to justify her sacrifices, to justify her decision to keep me rather than abort me. But unbeknown to me, I kept disappointing her. So failure in her eyes became a self-fulfilling prophecy. My 11-year stint in America changed that, and it was cathartic for me. In America, no one was there to put me down. No one was there to criticize me. No one was there to say I couldn't achieve. I could start on a clean palette. There was no one to judge me on past mistakes because no one knew me. I was accepted for who I was. If I never lived in America, I don't know what type of woman I would have been today. My mother was happy I was out of sight. She was happy that she could tell her friends that I worked for a prestigious organisation. She was happy to tell her friends that I owned my own house, and I was doing so well. She was happy that at last I was a success in her eyes. When I told her I was coming back 11 years later, she asked me why I was coming back and that I should stay where I was. I interpret that to mean that she didn't want me around. But I think on reflection, it was because she knew that I had flowered in America. I think she knew that coming back to the UK, I would remind her once again of her past and her failures, although I didn't know it then. When I came back and shared with her how things were not going right in certain areas of my life, I think she felt responsible. When I was out of the way, she didn't have to contend with what was not going right in my life. My mother had been relieved of that responsibility, along with reminders of how she believed she had failed me. Like many of the Windrushians, my mother wanted the perfect painting. She wanted her life to be picture perfect, a life that everyone she knew would admire and envy. She tried hard to create that painting, and every now and then I would come by and smudge that painting, not deliberately, but accidentally, because I was unaware at the time that the painting was still wet and still needed work. My mother was one of the many Commonwealth citizens who came to the UK with the stigma instilled in her of not being good enough, being treated as less than, constantly trying to prove to themselves and to others that they were equal and deserved to be treated with respect, constantly trying to prove that they were not failures, that they could achieve. And that was why buying a home, paying off a mortgage, having the appearance of affluence was so important to them. When my mother heard about the Windrushians who had been deported and deprived of their estate in the UK, she would say, "Thank God I had my passport. Thank God I decided to go to Spain." And because in the 80s it was the first time she had travelled, and that was the time she realised she needed a passport. She would always say how rudely she was treated by the Home Office when she tried to obtain her passport, but she got her British passport ahead of the Windrush scandal. So even though I was born out of a stigma, it was important for my mother to prove she was not a failure, and no one, including me, would make her feel like one. My mother doubted my love, but I think it was because she didn't believe she had earned it. My mother would always say she wished she could have done more for me. She wished things had been different. She saw my perceived failure as her fault, so she rejected my love. It is liberating being here at this point in my life, loving her regardless of whether she accepted my love or not. My mother was instrumental in me fighting for credibility and relevance. My mother is the reason for the courage and strength you see before you. And being born under the astrological sign of Libra is the reason you see me trying to balance views when sharing injustices. And that's all for now. Bye-bye.